right, and so our next speaker is going to be Hassan Aleem, who is a PhD student in the neuroaesthetics laboratory at Georgetown University, working with Dr. Norberto Grzywacz on how our aesthetic preferences may change over time. Hassan, if you can share your presentation, take it away.
Thank you so much. I had so many screens open, I didn't really scroll down.
We can see your screen.
So thank you everybody for, thank you for the introduction. So yes, my name is Hassan and PhD student at Georgetown University, and today I'm going to be talking to you about something perhaps a little bit different and not familiar to a lot of you, but I'm hoping that it'll be something that garners a lot of interest and questions. So I study aesthetics, and the basic question that I'm going to be talking about today is investigating how these aesthetic preferences change over time. So
Hassan, can I just briefly stop you? Would you mind trying to talk a little bit closer to your microphone?
Sure.
Your audio
Absolutely.
is really...
Is this better?
It is a little bit better, yes. Thank you.
So just a quick background into neuroaesthetics as a field. If you may not be familiar, this is the definition from the Max Planck Institute for Aesthetics, and it basically says that the aim of neuroaesthetics is to use scientific methods to explain the psychological, neuronal, and social cultural biases of aesthetic perceptions and judgments. So when you read that, you might imagine something like this. You know, you're primarily concerned with looking at a painting, perhaps something abstract, and trying to understand what's going on in the brain, but neuroaesthetics has become a lot more than just that. It encompasses a wide range of things. For example, questions regarding beauty and all sorts, such as nature, such as food, and the multisensory experiences related to that, dance, fashion, music, architecture, and the list goes on and on. So there's a lot more to neuroaesthetics and the kind of questions that can be asked, and that's what makes it kind of an interesting field as far as how many topics in the cognitive sciences it kind of dips into. So what are the open questions currently in the field, and specifically the questions that we're studying? So the main questions that we're studying have to do with what is the underlying nature of aesthetic preferences, and this comes in two parts broadly. The first part is how do aesthetic preferences arise? And to begin to answer this question, we developed a computational model which basically outlines how aesthetic preferences may develop over a lifetime through a reward-based learning process. I'm not going to be talking to you about that too much today, but I'm going to be talking to you about a project that kind of follows that, which basically follows a prediction regarding that model, which is how do aesthetic preferences persist over time. So we know that aesthetic preferences are not stable. Our preferences, our fashions and trends change over time. And when you look across the globe or even across different cities and towns, there's different fashions and trends and preferences. So it's clear that preferences are not stable in any way in time and place. And when you think of the whole developmental life scheme of an individual, they're moving throughout time in these times and places throughout their whole lifetime. So it doesn't, it makes easy assumption to assume that preferences will not be so stable for the individual overall over a lifetime. But the questions that remain open are to what extent does this happen and how does this happen? So in an attempt to answer these questions, we, from current study, which just a few demographical information, it had included 44 participants through prolific. And this is the basic outline of the study. We had participants come in for the first visit where they performed two alternative forced choice tasks. And this forced choice task basically asked them to pick between two different stimuli and in the regards to which they prefer more or less. Then we had them do a brief personality survey / a digit span memory task. And then they repeated this experiment again. So this was our first session. Then subsequently, we had participants come back for another session where they performed the same task with the same stimuli. And this happened a total of 4 more times. So this leads to a total measurement of aesthetic preferences and their stability over a 4-week period. And this is, to our knowledge, one of the only existing studies that really tries to look at in a fine-grained way what happens to your preferences over time over a repeatable weekly interval. So the question that when we were designing the study was, how do we design a study where there's so many different, like I mentioned before, aesthetics span such a broad range of topics. So we wanted to kind of design a paradigm which included a continuous set of context invariant stimuli. And what I mean by that is, so what we did for that was we basically split and used the color space, and we split the color space into a hue, saturation, and value into equally spaced regions, and in 3 categories. And an illustration of that is the following. So we had 3 different categories: shirts, cars, and phone cases. And so as you can see, that this is kind of a continuous space, and this overall stimuli, which is color, is invariant to the different categories, allowing us to see what happens to aesthetic preferences that are bounded and that are changing dependent on different contexts as well. So measuring instability across the different time points is a tough task because it's you can measure it in very different ways. And one of the first things that we see in our results is that subjects show a varied and individual degree of relative instability in their preferences. And these 2 polar plots illustrate this in a nice way. So just to orient you, the markers basically show the different hue values, and the graphs, the actual plots show the amount of times that a certain hue was picked, in this case for t-shirts, in a pre-setting and after 30 minutes. So you can see for this subject, they're showing incredible stability. They're picking something almost exactly the same amount of times, whereas for this subject, after 30 minutes, they're showing some pretty drastic changes in what shirts they picked and what colors they picked in a pre and a post time. So different subjects had different stabilities and across different time points as well. So one method to measure this instability that we used, and I'm going to be talking about here, is to convert these choices into rankings and then use a L1 distance between those to basically simplify how far are the overall rankings between different time points. So that's going to be the measure that I'm talking about in the overall results. So our main result is that aesthetic preferences drift over time. And what you see at the bottom here is the instability on the y-axis and the duration of times on the x-axis. And what you see is that over time, as more time goes on, you see an increase in instability with everything that's not indicated being significant differences. However, a question that was important for us to understand, and this is relative to a starting point. However, a question for us to understand was like, what happens if you freeze one starting point? And here's a little guide down below to make it a little bit easier to understand the different starting points. So A being pre, B being 30 minutes. So we froze that starting point and only looked at what happens if you only look in context to the first starting point. And you see that most of the changes happen within the first week. However, after that, there's a relative stability. And when you think about it, that makes sense because you wouldn't expect in a continuous space for your preferences to completely go in a complete a linear curve and flip completely because they're bounded in a way. So what you see is that relative to your first starting point, you're seeing a change, but then a steady state and then stability that is achieved. And when you look at this in terms of all of the time points, what you see is a really interesting pattern developing, which is that successive choices may lead to a sort of crystallization of preferences, albeit with inherent noise. So here you see everything relative to the first time point. And you see that there's a general increase as time goes on, and similarly to the 30-minute and post time point, etc. But however, you do see a downward trend in terms of the baseline stability. So what we believe may be happening is that the mere effects of making a choice and asking subjects to look inward and make choices regarding their preferences would be leading to a concurrent decrease in a crystallization in their preferences and leading to a concurrent relative decrease in stability. However, as time goes on, they're still unstable in general. So that's the noise that exists in the system. When we looked at different factors, we found that there weren't many differences in regards to age, in regards to sex, but we did find differences in age. So as time goes on, or as you look at it across the different age groups, you see that there is a decrease in instability, or basically saying that there is older individuals in our study tended to be more stable as compared to younger individuals. And this is something that is in contrast to a previous finding, which showed opposite results. So it's something that we're looking to investigate a little bit more and understand why the differences may have been arised. So you do see different age-dependent effects as well. So in conclusion, what we show is that aesthetic preferences tend to drift as time passes. And we also see an interesting dynamic interactions where merely making a choice may lead to changes in preferences in themselves. We showed that older adults tended to be more stable, while there were no sex-based differences. And lastly, we also showed that different categories of didn't present this data, but just for audience interest, different categories of the objects did not elicit any differences in stability. And I believe my time is up, so I will.
Hassan, thank you very much for being on time. Your talk has sprouted a plethora of questions. I think you're able to see the chat. So I would like you to, after this, maybe go into the chat and try to discuss with the attendees there. I'm going to read out a couple of the questions from the Q&A because I'm not sure you can see those. The first one would be a very interesting question. How does one view this in an evolutionary context?
Yeah, so I think it, you can look at it in a few different ways, but for me, I think it makes a lot of sense in an evolutionary context, because if your environment and your body states are constantly changing when you're outside, and when you think about aesthetic preferences or preferences in general, they're one of the main effects is attention and survival. So if your context, is changing, seasons change, etc., or you're not hungry or you are hungry, you would want your preferences to update in regards to the changing environments, and not be, kind of stuck in previous times. Same goes with if you look at different populations. For example, there's studies with symmetry preferences in Hatsa tribe versus European populations, and you see that there's a greater preference for symmetry in communities where pathogens are more common. So adapting to the local conditions seems to be the status quo, and something that would make a lot of sense to me.
Great, thank you. Could you actually confirm something real quick? Do you have access to the Q&A?